Escaped Sapiens.
One of the most interesting features of human intelligence is that it comes with personality. We aren't all the same, and our thoughts aren't purely logical. They're instead sculpted by our level of hunger, how tired we are, the presence of mind-altering drugs in our systems, our sexuality, stress, and any number of internal and external factors. So how did humans end up with our peculiar psychology? And what sort of control does our evolutionary past have over the thoughts we're able to have and the behaviors we're able to express as individuals? In this episode of the podcast, I speak with evolutionary psychologist Dianna Fleischman to find out. In this conversation, Dianna unmasks some of the more wild and curious features of our evolved psychology. This is a conversation that ranges from human sexuality and fetishes, to cannibalism, to the Me Too movement, to disgust sensitivity, to sex differences in behavior and cognition, to the impact that modern technology has on our societal beliefs and values. I hope you enjoy. What is evolutionary psychology, to start with?
Evolutionary psychology is a lens through which we view human behavior and human nature. So the basic idea is that human beings evolved like all non-human animals, and our behavior evolved for adaptively relevant reasons, and obviously within the constraints that are available to us, both physiologically and behaviorally. So there are things that we could not learn to do as humans, and there are things, certain other constraints that are involved. But yes, thinking about the costs and benefits, adaptive benefits of various different aspects of psychology, and thinking about human being psychology as either adaptations or byproducts or noise. So trying to figure out why certain psychological phenomena exist, and trying to also figure out if there are behavioral adaptations.
How do you, it sounds like, evolution occurred over billions of years. So how do you pinpoint a moment in time in which certain characteristics or behaviors developed? I mean, so usually when you're dealing with evolution, you have a fossil record or something along those lines. So is there an analog in your field? So, psychological fossils. What do you do to test your hypotheses?
There's a few different aspects of it. There's a really good paper David Buss wrote with some of my colleagues, which is called how to test evolutionary psychology hypotheses. But I'll tell you that there's a few different aspects to your question. So the first is that Leda Cosmides and John Tooby and some other of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology came up with this idea called the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And the idea there is that human beings have arrived, but our ancestors lived in a variety of different environments and with a variety of different physiologies, right? So ostensibly, human beings in part evolved, on the African savanna, but there's a lot of consistent aspects of our evolutionary history that you can infer without knowing a ton in terms of fossil evidence. So we know that human beings have two sexes, and that women lactate, and that we were sensitive to parasites and pathogens. We know that we had kin, and we had ways of conceptualizing who was our kin and who was not our kin, because we see that, for example, in hunter-gatherers. We know that people were vulnerable when they were injured, and that without help they could have died. We know that we lived in an environment with light, where there was day and night. So these are all things that seem trivial to talk about, but they're all the building blocks of how you would expect, human nature to evolve. And another aspect is that, we know because of not even closely related species, but for example, like mammals, pretty much all mammals have some degree of looking after their offspring. They all have, for example, parental adaptations. And so one way of considering, what is in the human repertoire of, psychology, evolved psychology, is to look at closely related non-human animals and or non-human animals that share a certain ecology or social ecology with us as well. The other aspect is, if behavior doesn't fossilize, how do we know what exists? Well, there's a variety of ways to look at that. So this is one reason why evolutionary psychologists are somewhat more likely to look at cross-cultural research than more typical cognitive or social psychologists, is because one way that we can figure out if one piece of evidence that there is an evolved human nature in some respect is if we see it universally. So there is, no culture in which women have gotten together in a group or a band with weapons to go and kill women of another group and kidnap their men. That's never happened. It's never happened that women have waged war on other women. Unless you think about the mythological Amazons. That's one reason that they captured the imagination so much, is because it was so contrary to what's received as human nature. So there's, certain things that we know have never happened, and there's things that we know have happened over and over again. And, David Buss, who did, I think it was 1989 study of something like 33 cultures, he thought, for example, that there was an adaptive preference that men had to be with women who had very little sexual experience before, because a woman's previous sexual experience to a relationship with you is indicative of her degree of fidelity. And that gets to paternity uncertainty. Basically, men want offspring they know to be theirs. And if you, marry somebody slutty, then, and I use the word slutty in the nicest way possible. I myself think being slutty is fine. But basically, if you marry somebody slutty, they're very likely to commit infidelity, or more likely to commit infidelity. So he thought that men might have a preference for women who had very few sexual partners all over the world. And that just wasn't the case. In China, for example, this was in the late 80s. I don't really think things have changed very much. We see that men and women actually have a pretty strong preference for a partner who has very little sexual experience. But in places like Scandinavia, marrying a virgin is considered not just not desirable, but actually pretty weird. So he thought that there was going to be some universality. Dan Fessler was interested in how much men prefer women who have smaller feet, because smaller feet is an indicator of nulliparity, which means like you haven't had kids before, and nulliparity is potentially adaptive because it means that you have, more access to that particular woman's lifetime reproductive potential. He actually found some interesting stuff. I'll just tell you one little example. So almost everybody prefers somewhat smaller than average women's feet. When women have babies, their feet get bigger, whatever. One interesting thing was that there was one culture, now I can't remember, it was a culture in, I think, Central Africa, where men preferred women with bigger feet. And what was going on there is that women have to work the homestead, work the farm, while men go out to work. So the idea that I think was postulated in a talk that I saw Dan Fessler give was that men preferred women with bigger feet because it indicated that they were stronger and bigger and better able to work the farm. So even in those cases, you might have an adaptive evolved preference for some signals of nulliparity, like small feet, but you'll see a cultural difference in this, in that, okay, well, maybe somebody with bigger feet is actually going to be more relevant to me in my current circumstances. So I think that gets to kind of some of the major points. But the last thing I'll say is that, evolutionary psychologists, we think about things top down and kind of bottom up. So one thing is, we can see some aspect of human behavior out in the world, and we could say, okay, is this adaptive, and in what context would it be adaptive? So we have to make very specific predictions. Or we can have like kind of a top down, like, okay, what kind of thing would be adaptive? So what would be adaptive for men and women to know about each other, or what would be adaptive for women to do, for example, in the context of child rearing? Is there an adaptation for that? So for example, a lot of non-human animals show lactational aggression. It makes sense if you have a very vulnerable newborn that you would be very vigilant against predators or, anyone else who might want to hurt them. And I think her name's Jennifer Hahn Holbrook. She did a really cool study with bottle feeding mothers and with breastfeeding mothers, and found that breastfeeding mothers were more aggressive in a laboratory context against somebody who annoyed them. I think the aggressive paradigm she used was like these women were blasting people with white noise. So that's like it's very hard to measure aggression actually in the lab, but this is something that you would expect from an adaptationist perspective, that, for example, women be aggressive when they're breastfeeding against potential interlopers and against potential threats.
Did the women in that study know they were going to be annoyed? Did they know that was...
I actually don't remember exactly how she annoyed them, but it was pretty cool, kind of outcome. And, there's a lot of other kind of very specific predictions you could make about that. There's interesting studies of like reaction time. So if I show you an array of images Let's say I show you a large visual array of mushrooms or flowers, and there's one spider. You're going to be better at picking out that spider. Or if I show you an array of smiling faces with one angry face, you'll be better at picking out that one angry face. And there's stuff where you can look at, somebody's particular state. Dan just did amazing studies on this stuff, so Dan was interested in formidability. And so Dan Fessler was interested in formidability, how men estimate each other's formidability, because men fight, and men in every culture fight, and it's obvious if you think about it. And he did a really cool study where he tied male participants to a chair and then had them rate how formidable someone was, a picture of somebody. And men who were tied to a chair thought somebody was like more formidable. And studies that both Dan and I have done, which indicate some evolved psychology, is nowadays we don't really think much about ectoparasites, so like things like fleas and ticks, but those things are very important, and they're very adaptive for non-human animals. And so I found evidence that people's skin sensitivity increases when they see maggots or fleas or ticks, which is a very specific prediction, and there's not really any other way to explain it.
Have you heard of the Trobriand Islands at all?
No, the Trobriand, you mean Trobriand Islands?
I don't know how it's pronounced. I've only ever read it. But this is a group where the women are sterilized by the yams they eat, right? And their idea of how women conceive is completely separate from sex. Have you looked at?
Yeah, there are some cultures in which it seems like they don't know that sex makes babies, like consciously. Yeah. That makes entirely. The conscious awareness of anything. One common misconception I see is, I give an evolutionary psychology explanation, and somebody will say, well, I don't want to have kids. I'm not interested in children. I'm like, yeah, but there's an unbroken line from like your mother to like the first amoeba of sexual reproduction. Like that had some influence on you. Your current attitude is going to be less influential in many ways than that unbroken line. And so, I think David Buss was very skeptical of that claim that anybody doesn't know that sex causes reproduction, but I think it's perfectly reasonable. Yeah.
Well, the reason why I bring it up, so if I could only find one article really on these islands, and apparently this is a culture where the women do chase down and rape men under certain circumstances. So I was wondering if you knew anything, but if this isn't in your background, we don't. No,
I have no idea about that. There are, so like in central Amazon, there are these pink Amazonian river dolphins called Brota cor-de-rosa, and the common conception in the tribe is that there are women that nobody wants, and these women conceive with the dolphins, right? The dolphins, they take human form, I don't know, in special magical ways, and then these women conceive. So like my credulity about stories that people make up about like reproduction, or like people make up about women who are like too ugly to have sex with, obviously they're not. So.
No, well, it wasn't based. So the article that I read, and again, I shouldn't be talking about an article I read many years ago, but in any case, the article that I read mentioned that in the society, when men wandered outside of regions where they were allowed to be, they were essentially free game from women from other tribes. And so they were essentially, women would take advantage of men they found outside of the appropriate territories. But,
that would make sense if so there is a group, I can't remember, I don't know if it's the Aceh, there's a group of Central or South American peoples where it's the maternal uncle that does almost all the paternal care, and like the actual men who make babies with women, women don't have like consistent pair bonds. So it's the maternal uncle who knows that he's at least a quarter related to these kids, that he invests in them. So I guess it would make sense for, if you're just entirely looking for genetic material and you're not at all looking for investment, then I guess you would just want to pick out the most robust person that you could find, and there's tons of other species that do this. But yeah, again, we're both talking about something we don't know anything about.
So let's get back onto something we do know something about.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I like to think of myself as a rational person who uses logic and who, my brain works like a computer in my own conception, but it's absolutely not true, right? Like I get hungry, I get annoyed, maybe an attractive girl walks by, different things influence the way that I think. And so in what way does the fact that we have physical bodies and we exist in these groups influence the way, the thoughts that we're able to have? Does our physical body influence the capacity that we have for thought?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that they do. One example that I liked, so what I'm writing about currently is about relationships between men and women, and about a lot of that is about adaptive self-deception. So I might think that I'm angry about one thing, but really I'm angry about another thing that I don't want to admit. So in order to punish somebody for a behavior that I don't like, I make up a story about something else. For example, my husband says he doesn't like something I cooked for dinner. That makes me feel like he's not adequately committed to me, that he could be stolen by someone else who he likes their cooking better. But that's obviously a ridiculous reason to get angry. So I act like I'm angry about something completely different. That he, I don't know, turned up the stereo too loud or something. And so that facilitates my punishment of a behavior that I dislike. And I might not even know why. So I talk a lot in this book that I'm writing about how we punish people in ways that we are not always consciously aware of. But one of my favorite studies about this particular phenomenon is a study that showed that basically the best predictor of whether or not couples will argue is the low blood sugar of the couple. So hangry couples tend to argue more. So the lower your blood sugar, the more likely you would argue. And they also did a really funny aspect of this particular study where they gave each of the couple like a sort of an effigy, like a little stuffed doll that was representative of the other person in the couple. And then they saw how many pins they stuck in the doll as a function of how, as I said, it's difficult to measure aggression. So you gotta make little voodoo effigies and stuff. And so, yeah, they found that people were more likely to argue and also more symbolically aggressive when they were hungrier. Now, how does that make any sense? I think that what happens is that when we are hungry or when we're in pain, regardless of who's around, we tend to punish whoever is close by. So if I lose my keys and there's just somebody who's, witlessly happens to be around, in some sense, my anger is going to land on them, even though they had nothing to do with me necessarily losing my keys. There's a study where they have, two rats in a cage, and one of them gets shocked, and the other one is kind of up on a chair, kind of tied to like a little rat chair. And the rat who gets shocked attacks the other rat, just in case he was the one who, turned on the electric grid. So I think that we're very prone to punish people around us because, in terms of our evolved psychology, you could never be sure that the person who's closest by is not the person who hid your keys. Or I could never be sure that the reason I'm hungry is because I wasn't adequately provisioned by someone who was supposed to feed me or who was supposed to take care of me, right? And toddlers and other, we're, in my view, and what I'm writing about now, we're constantly rewarding and punishing people. And oftentimes we're doing so in ways that don't actually change their behavior in ways that are adaptive to us. But on average, punishing and rewarding the people around us. You see this with children all the time. They freak out when they're hungry. They act incredibly sweet and adorable when they're being well fed. And, they're rewarding you for giving them food, especially sugar.
So is the type of intelligence that, the high intelligence that humans have in some sense unique? By which I mean, if you took some species that was very different to us, say a bird or an octopus or something like this, and you gave it selective pressure over many generations to make them super intelligent, say, would we end up with something that's very similar to what we have as a human? Or, in other words, do the constraints you need to impose in order to get intelligence sort of lead to the sort of intelligence that humans have? Or would we expect very different sorts of intelligences from?
You would expect very different sorts of intelligences, but you also have to think about the constraints that you're dealing with. I have a friend called Therese Lawry, and she wrote a guest blog on Put a Num on It about octopi. And something that's very interesting about octopi, or octopuses, she said octopi is actually wrong, is that the females, they actually don't engage in a whole lot of care of offspring, or they do for a little while, and then they either go off or they kill themselves. Like in captivity, they will sometimes kill themselves right after they have offspring, when they actually could live a really long time. So why don't they engage in more care of the offspring? In emperor penguins, there's the story of what was that famous movie, Trek of the Penguins, Journey of the Penguins? What was it called? Anyway, it was about these penguins in Antarctica, and you see them, just holding these eggs on their feet and transferring the eggs over to each other and trying to keep their eggs warm and engaging in this incredibly costly paternal and maternal care. This movie was very widely lauded because the penguins were showing like really perfect like human marriage. They were just so invested in their offspring. And then in the summertime, the baby penguins, they get in the sea, and their parents completely forget which penguin baby is theirs. They go in the sea, and like half of them get eaten, right? So like there's just this arbitrary cutoff of where paternal and maternal care like end. And so there's just a lot of mysteries about what's going to happen that's adaptively relevant, and what kind of constraints. What's the constraints at that point that are making the penguins not care for their offspring? And what are the constraints that a variety of species have? What are the constraints that make octopuses not really care for their offspring after they hatch? So we don't necessarily know. We don't know what would happen if there's, I can't remember who this guy's, I think it's George Dvorsky, but don't quote me on that, who
I won't.
Had this amazing like transhumanist thought experiment. Like, what if we could amplify the intelligence of like birds and whales and fish, and we could do some kind of weird flowers for Algernon thing with the whales, and they could actually like directly communicate with us. They could figure it out, and we could have this this line of communication. And it's a beautiful thought experiment, but you also have to imagine that it'd be very difficult to communicate, and they would have a variety of thoughts and feelings that would be uncommunicable to us. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess one way that you could ask the question is, you could ask, is there sexual dimorphism in human psychology? And if women and men have roughly the same intelligence, then is this a good example where you can look at intelligence that's been evolved under different selective pressure? That would be one way to pull out some sort of understanding of where this question lies, right?
Yeah, you definitely do see that, in men and women, that their intelligence evolved under different, selection pressure. And there are things that men and women find, much, much easier to do than each other. Even though my psychology is somewhat masculinized, I do have a lot of like the normal feminine cognitive qualities. I can remember people and names very, very easily, and I can notice hundreds of details about people and infer lots about them when I meet them. Whereas a lot of men I know, and my husband in particular, are terrible at that.
What are the main differences psychologically between men and women that you can find?
So the kind of neat and tidy way that people often talk about it is they talk about men being systematizers and women being mentalizers or empathizers. So women being better at inferring, for example, mental states, and better at theory of mind. That is, better at figuring out what people want and reading their facial expressions. Although facial expression stuff has been walked back somewhat. It does seem that women are better at recognizing facial expressions than men, but their superiority might not be as great as we once thought. And men are better at systematizing. That is, they tend to be better and have more interest in systems of things like folk physics and how objects interact in space. That's folk physics. But also, if I'm just talking about cognitive styles, those are a couple of the major cognitive styles that are different. If you look at some of the biggest cognitive differences between men and women, you'll get into something called spatial rotation. And what we see in non-human animals is that males have a larger territory range. They often have multiple females, or they're foraging, or they're keeping a certain range of territory. and the territory is large enough that they can't navigate only on landmarks. So they tend to have a better spatial navigation ability. And human males are better at spatial navigation than human women are. And there's even evidence that this starts to emerge as early as like 5 months of age. They did some really interesting studies with, showing infants rotated objects. If you flip to the mirror version of the image, boy babies are more likely to look longer, which indicates that they're surprised that the image is flipped instead of rotated. And so that's one way that they've tested that.
What age is that? What age is that test at?
5 months old.
Wow, and there's already a difference then.
There's already a difference then. Although I will say, so I did a seminar on sex differences, and I will say that one flaw that I see in sex differences research is that people tend to infer that if something's not available to measure, within the first couple years of life, that it's socialized rather than that it's evolved. And female babies are not born with breasts, but their breasts were not socialized on. They grew as a function of their genetic programming. So there are a lot of changes that happen at puberty, but there's also a lot of changes that you see at puberty between males and females of other species and like in monkeys and things, for example.
In general, how do you, so I'm guessing you compare with other species to see, is this effect socialized or it's biological? What are the other ways that you can actually tease this apart?
I think that the human universals thing is one way that we look at that.
So different cultures.
Yeah. So if we see, there are very few cultures in which males care for children even half as much as women care for their children. If you look at cultures around the world, women tend to invest a whole lot more in offspring. You can also look at, non-human animals, although some people find that not especially compelling because either they don't think that non-human animals are similar enough to humans. I had a whole debate about free will with this woman, and I was basically saying, unless you think that animals also have free will, it doesn't make sense to talk about humans having free will. And people thought that was a glib point, that of course humans are qualitatively different from non-human animals, and that's obvious. So that was one reason that I was really attracted to evolutionary psychology, was because of this comparison that was very readily available with non-human animals. And if you look at cultural, the kinds of people who do cultural psychology, or the kind of social psychologists who talk about things being culturally governed, it just seems like this black box where we don't exactly know how it works, for everything from stereotypes to family arrangements to work ethic. How is this stuff communicated? There's a lot of stuff, for example, where people say that, like East Asians or Jewish Americans do very well in terms of earnings and success because of the way that they are raised or the culture that they're brought up in. I mean, my view is that if that was the case, then Chinese and Jewish nannies would be in very high demand because there'd be some hope that they would rub some of their culture off. But that's not the case.
Or people aren't conceptualizing that, perhaps. One thing that I wonder about when it comes to cultural universality, though, is, it could be the case that cultures where women primarily look after the children are just, they outcompete cultures where that is not the case, right? How do you account for that? Is there some way that you can do that, or?
Yeah, so there's these ideas about sort of group selection or cultures competing with one another. It's been a while since I've looked at this stuff. It does make sense to me that if a variety of different groups are in competition with one another, that you could see some selection effects such that one group would necessarily win out. I don't necessarily think that a culture in which women take care of offspring is necessarily going to be more successful. I think it probably has more to do, with ecology. And another thing that you see oftentimes is, a culture where people were encouraged to get, have children would probably outcompete one in which they were not as well. And that's also not something you necessarily see. So yeah, that would be something that you could have somebody on to talk about, but I'm not super well versed in the group selection debate. But it still goes on, and it's been going on since the late, maybe even the early 80s.
I guess in some sense it probably doesn't matter, right? Because I imagine that if you had so say for example you had some socially imposed constraint, through some social mechanism, it's the women who are doing primary childcare, say. Over enough generations, that would actually enforce some sort of selection pressure, right? So you'd have some sort of, I imagine you'd have a back reaction, which would end up in some biological difference. Is that not the case? Or?
Well, it's not, somebody has to take care of offspring, and I'll give you an interesting non-human animal example. So in fish, the females lay the eggs, and then the males usually cover those eggs in sperm. Who is going to be more easily abandoning those eggs? It's actually the female that can more easily abandon those eggs, because they can lay their eggs and they can leave. And then by the time the male is finished inseminating the eggs, the female's already gone. Mm-hmm. And that's actually why you see so much paternal investment in fish, is because it happens so often that females abandoned and males were left kind of holding the bag. So it's kind of a game theory, like first mover, whoever can abandon first will. And you see the most extreme outcome of that particular trajectory in seahorses, where the females actually inject or oviposit their eggs into the male's brooding pouch, and the males are pregnant instead of the females. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of extension of that trajectory. And so in humans, it's just much easier for males to abandon, because by the time the insemination is finished, the female's got to still do like nine months of gestating and 2 years of breastfeeding, or 3 years of breastfeeding. If you're looking at most hunter-gatherer women breastfeed for much, much longer than women in industrial cultures. And so yeah, it's much, much easier for males to abandon their offspring. And I have a blog, and I also talk about this in the book. If you were to say, for men, the lowest possible investment they can make in offspring is 10 minutes of time. And for women, the lowest possible investment they can make in offspring is 9 months plus 3 years. That would be like saying that for a woman to buy a baby, it costs $32,000. And for a man to buy a baby, it costs $1. And so obviously, in terms of what's adaptive for the man, it makes more sense for him to buy another baby for another dollar, rather than like put a lot of money into the baby that he has. So with one particular woman. So men have, basically males have a lot of different potential strategies. And if a woman is not going to look after her offspring very intensely, she's either got to make offspring that are like better able at fending for themselves, or she's got to convince somebody else to help her out. So, if you lived in a group where grandparents lived for a really long time and they were really invested in offspring, then yeah, you would need less paternal care. Or if you lived in a group where women were really good at training men to take better care of their offspring, or women really policed one man per woman, women would never be co-wives, for example, then it doesn't make a lot of sense for a man to try to seek out another mate, for example.
Are women in general better at sort of manipulation and training in this regard, or is there some sort of sexual training that women do of men in terms of looking after their children? Or
that's the thesis of basically my book, is that the basic idea is that for men, they have a major way of convincing other people to do what they want, and that's through physical force or the threat of physical force. That's through basic formidability. And you see this in all kinds of animals. And in men, their status hierarchy is much more stable than women's status hierarchy, because a lot of the status hierarchy comes down to who's the biggest and who's the strongest and who's the youngest, or who's got the most experience. There's prestige and status and formidability. These things all have an interplay with each other, but it's relatively stable. So because women don't have recourse to these two techniques, other than with small children or women smaller than themselves, they have to use more sophisticated methods to try to get other people to do what they want. And given that men can be either a tremendous boon to women or a tremendous danger to women. One of the main ways that babies and young children are killed around the world is by stepfathers or by unrelated males. And you see this also in like a lot of non-human animals. Men killing babies because they want all of the woman's reproductive resources devoted to their child. And if you have a 1-year-old, if you kill that 1-year-old, a woman's going to ovulate again, and she's going to be able to get pregnant with your baby again. You see this in lions, you see this in baboons, etc. So women have to use sophisticated tactics to try and help men to provision them, to take care of their offspring, and to not hurt them or their offspring, which men are wont to do. So it's actually, because they're trying to control other humans who are much bigger and stronger than them, that women develop these abilities, but also because women have to train their offspring to not do dangerous things and to do socially acceptable things and to live in the culture in which they are living. So women have a lot of training to do compared to men.
It's strange though, right? Because men are interacting directly with women. So you'd imagine that they would also pick up and also men carry a lot of genetic material that women also carry. So why is it that the benefit is only sort of, why is it that women benefit primarily from this if both members of the species are interacting with each other and both, does it sit on just the X chromosome? Well, men have that as well. Why is it that...
Well, sex differentiated, is complicated. There's a SRY gene. Yeah, so there are genes on the sex chromosomes that turn on and off other genes, right? You could just as easily say, why don't women have chest hair or testicles?
Right.
Right? There's this these things that get turned on and off, and when you see some disorders of intersex, for example, androgen insensitivity syndrome, that's where there are no receptors for testosterone whatsoever. And so the default sex is female. And these people, they grow up to look and act just like other biological women. And in fact, they are often like models and actresses and stuff because they have the bone structure of men. They're very tall and they don't grow very much body hair because they don't have any testosterone receptors. So they often end up being like hyper feminine looking, even though they're XY, and even though they actually have in their abdomens vestigial testes. For these kinds of people, I think you would also see a very typical feminine psychology, because I imagine that lots of these things get turned on and off by early hormone exposure, or by, other genes. So I can't tell you exactly why you would see this difference, but, you do see differences in nurturing behavior and rough tempo play between the sexes in all these different species. And it's almost certainly, moderated genetically. It's just we might not know exactly how, what the cluster of genes is or what the regulatory system is that's turning on and off these behaviors or propensities.
Can we see this in brain imaging? Like, are we able to, if I gave you a selection of female brains and a selection of male brains, would you be able to distinguish them at a physical level with what technology we have today?
I used to know more about this, but this area has moved very, very quickly. There's a woman called Gina Rippon, there's Cordelia Fine, and there's another woman who have all written various different pieces saying there is no one characteristic that distinguishes male and female brains. Yes, that is potentially true. There's a close call, but using an algorithm and a computational, like using brain imaging and a computational algorithm, I think that you can tell a man and a woman's brain apart. I want to say 94% of the time, 96% of the time. That's one piece. Another thing is that I think that the whole brain debate, like can we tell men and women's brains apart, is pretty specious because, if you showed me a picture of my grandmother's brain and the serial killer Ted Bundy's brain, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. One is a 94-year-old German woman, and the other one murdered I don't know how many women in a sorority house, right? So like, I just think that like, our ability to actually tell much about the psychology of a person based on their brain is not so good, and it doesn't seem actually like it's like structural differences that make that indicate very much. So I think that the whole brain craze was motivated by this idea that like we could have like some objective thing like that's not self-report, which psychology is riddled with, that would enable us to better figure out these different phenomena. And there's even, a couple studies of gay men's brains versus straight men's brains, trying to find differences between them. But I've never found these things either very compelling or very conclusive.
Mm-hmm. I guess also, I could have asked the question, if there were two of me, if I had a twin and you got one of me really drunk, such that my behavior was perturbed somewhat, and then you killed us both and then then you had both brains to study, you probably couldn't tell the difference between the two brains, but then I'm behaving completely differently because I'm drunk.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. The structure wouldn't be different. Although that if one of you was an alcoholic for 20 years and the other one wasn't, then I would be able to tell the difference structurally. Yeah.
No, we're both well behaved. But then I guess when it comes to people who are transgender or intersex, then also you probably wouldn't be able to do any scans that would, there's not necessarily visually a male brain or a female brain.
There's some evidence that there's a difference, but another thing that you have to consider is that there might be different reasons that people become trans. So, for example, my guilty pleasure, one of my guilty pleasures, is this show called My 600-Pound Life, which is like a very obese people and their struggles and travails and stuff like that. And in one episode, I remember seeing a gay man. He said he put on a woman's dress, he put on like a kind of corset, he put on a bra, and there were like men chatting him up all night. And like, he doesn't get that much attention as a fat man, but as a fat woman, he got tons of attention, right? And so you have to think that for many people, and this has been a very controversial issue, I would direct people to Galileo's middle finger has got like an interesting treatment of this, where there were a few different sex researchers who tried to taxonomize trans people, and also people who were saying, the kind of man stuck in a woman's body, woman stuck in a man's body idea, might not be the whole picture. For example, people might transition for other reasons. These people were really maligned. And so I do think that if we were going to come up with any kind of, biological difference between, trans people and cis people, you would almost certainly need some kind of taxonomy. And I think that the trans community, by and large, or maybe it's just the people who are the loudest in that community, seem very much against being categorized or taxonomized. And you see this in all kinds of areas of psychology. People are even upset about separating men and women as categories, or looking for sex differences. There definitely could be differeses in ancestral populations in terms of their psychologies. Because we know that, malarial resistance or Tay-Sachs or various other things are different among different populations. There could be psychological differences too, but I don't think that we're going to investigate them anytime soon, because taxonomizing humans in any way is controversial.
Yeah, I guess the question is, why do you want to know this information? Because quite often we've used it. Humans are good at seeking out differences and using that as a reason to treat each other not so nicely, I suppose. And so it's always going to be controversial.
Yeah. A few years ago, I think is when this started, they made a database of faces. I think it was in China they did this. And there was an algorithm that was able to detect at an above a chance level whether or not someone was criminally inclined. And they were calling this like new phrenology. And it's funny because people don't consider it's controversial. Like if I said that, in total millennial speak, like I went to a party and I was talking to this guy and like he gave me such a weird vibe. And then I found that like he groped my friend's breast on a date with her. And like I knew because I had a weird vibe about him. If I told you I had a weird vibe about somebody and then they did something like vaguely sexually inappropriate later, you wouldn't question that at all. So why wouldn't a computer be able to assess somebody's face or body movements or any other characteristic about them and figure out something quite similar? Like my intuition is just like an unconscious algorithm. It's not special in any way. There's nothing that can't be replicated computationally about it. It's just like people just don't like the idea that there are phrenological or physiognomy. People don't like the idea. And so there's this guy called Gerolf Rieger in the UK who has a bunch of papers on gaydar. So I could show you, I want to say, a 10-second silent video or GIF, I don't remember what it's called, of somebody's face while they're talking. And I think you could tell with like 84% accuracy if that person was gay or straight.
I probably couldn't.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot. You're like a mathy type person. Yeah. So that's. So I was at this conference. This was several years ago. It was called Born This Way, and so Gerolf Rieger was saying, men and women who are gay tend to show some psychological characteristics and manifestations of the opposite sex. So more masculine mannerisms. I think that they even did stuff where they like just conceptualize their face, where you actually couldn't see their face. I think there's like point light display kind of thing. And people were able to tell above chance whether somebody was gay or straight on that basis. And there was a guy at that conference who said he was very against the idea of calling those characteristics masculine or feminine. It offended him, the idea that gay men are more feminine. And I was like, well, as a woman, I'm offended that you're offended.
Yeah, there's no reason why that's feminine. It's strange though, right? Because in many cases, people become uncomfortable when you talk about biological determinism. So for example, when you talk about, I don't know, race or any of these controversial topics, but then when it comes to Born This Way, that's sort of like a biological determinism argument, right? So in that case, people are comfortable. If there was no controversy around this topic and it was just a question of interest, to what extent are human sexualities malleable? I mean, how far can, say for example, you're straight, how far can you push into the other direction through social influence, for instance? Okay.
So there is some evidence that women are more sexually fluid than men are. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy here. Men are much sluttier than women, right? Men have like a much greater desire for like a larger number of lifetime sexual partners. They're much more likely to want to have sex with somebody very soon after meeting them without knowing very much about them. And they're much more likely to want to have short-term sex with somebody regardless of their quality, right? If you look at like long-term mating, men have much higher standards than short-term mating. If you look at short-term mating, women's standards, who would you have a one-night stand with, right? So that's interesting. Men are also much less sexually disgust sensitive than women, much more likely to watch porn, much more likely to get into like weird, much more likely to have paraphilias. That is like foot fetishes, a variety of other kinds of things, right? Whereas women are much more likely to be bisexual and to be able to get into relationships of with people of either sex. So, Mike Bailey and Adam Safran and some other people have looked at bisexual versus straight psychology, and also looking at like the Kinsey scale, which is a scale of sexual orientation. So like I think it's like a 6 or a 7 is like super gay, a 0 or 1 is like super straight, and then there's bisexual in between. And women's sexual spectrum, the population, looks much more like a spectrum than men's, which much more looks like a bimodal kind of distribution. So there is a colleague of mine called Sarah Radke, and I did some studies on this back like in 2015, basically saying there are adaptive reasons why you might expect women to try to make friends with sex in a way that men don't make friends with sex, because the reproductive opportunity costs for women to make friends with sex are lower. If a man is having sex with another man, that's an opportunity that he's losing, not having sex with a woman, and he wants to be trying to reproduce, because, as I said, babies are really cheap for men, and they're very expensive for women. Whereas for women, they can form alliances with sex that are important to help them take care of offspring together. And you see this with bonobos. Bonobo females have sex with each other all the time. The males somewhat less often, and they do a lot of parental care, co-parental care. So the idea is that sex, there's an evolved pleasure system around sex, and then this has been leveraged to improve friendships and social alliances in various different ways. And so if you think about sex as like just the end of a spectrum, there's affection, there's kind of grooming, that's what all animals, mammals do with one another socially. And then you get all the way to sexual pleasure. There's a lot of ways to make people like you, as I say in the talk on this paper. You can feed people, you could take them on new experiences, you can give them drugs, you can have sex with them. And these are all ways to make people closer together. And so if it makes sense, if women need more help socially because they have offspring, that they might want to do this. Although, men also need help with each other. They need help going to war. They need help in terms of hunting. But there are cultures in which men had sex to facilitate these kinds of affiliations. But it seems much more varied from culture to culture than same-sex. Women are much more likely bisexual in other places. And in the study that I am talking about, which I think came out in 2015, I also talk about how 40 or 50 or 60% of cultures, there is some kind of socially approved same-sex sexual contact that people engage in. But for the most part, they're not gay. So like in Papua New Guinea, older men have sex with younger men, but they also have wives and they also get their wives pregnant. So you could say that being exclusively gay or having exclusively same-sex attraction is actually quite unusual.
Mm-hmm. But is that across the board in those cultures? As in, so my original question was, if you had someone who was gay or straight or however they identified, the question was, how malleable are we socially? So if you look at cultures such as in Papua, I don't know, is it particular tribes or?
Yeah, there's two different ones.
And then it's across the board there, is it? That
it's just like it's a maternal uncle, so like they're not related by blood, and a nephew, and I can't remember the two groups' names now. But the basic idea is that the more semen you swallow, the more masculine you become, and it's kind of like almost a cult kind of magical thinking thing. I think that if we had a widespread idea that you had to eat semen in order to become more masculine,
men would be all for it.
Yeah, I think that you'd see like men doing that too. I think it's just kind of the story. So I think that actually engaging in some degree of same-sex sexual contact is very malleable, but sexual orientation per se is not that malleable. And this is I can't remember what paper this was, but I think it might be Mascarella, this paper that's really good from the 1990s, that basically says, when you were looking, maybe it's because men were threatened by the idea that all men could be gay, but when you were looking at some of the early papers on same-sex sexual contact among men, they were like, okay, well, we can discount prisons. Like, that doesn't really count. We can discount what men do when they're young and when they're experimenting with each other, or like whatever the biscuit game they play in the UK where all the boys like apparently ejaculate on a cookie, and then whoever ejaculates last has to eat it. I don't actually remember. That seems a little bit gay. I think
they call this soggy sayo, or
that's right. Yeah. So I mean, I'm not a boy. I never play these games. And so there's when men were talking about, or usually male sexologists were talking about same-sex sexual attraction, they were discounting like all these incredibly common forms of same-sex sexual contact.
So remove all data points you don't want. Essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. And they were like, well, that's not real gay behavior. And because women can't penetrate each other, like a whole lot more gets counted as bisexual when women do it, because it's you don't have to go all the way for it to be considered sex if you're a woman. Whereas if you're a man, it seems Like even oral sex doesn't always get counted, right, for men. So long story short, it doesn't seem like sexual orientation is that malleable. I have this very edgy friend who says that there's a meta-analysis of gay conversion therapy. And actually, gay conversion therapy is more effective than you might think, although I haven't brought myself to read it because I don't want to become one of these like incredibly unpopular people who is like, actually, you can Clockwork Orange someone into not being gay anymore. It works, right? I don't want to do that. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if you paired pictures of naked people of your preferred sex, with pictures of shit, vomit, and lynchings, that ultimately you might lose attraction for those people. Although I don't think you would necessarily gain attraction for the other sex.
Even if sexuality was 100% socially constructed, then that wouldn't be a reason why you should be prejudiced or hate on people of different sex. I mean, if you're looking at things from that direction, then it should be okay to ask these questions.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, the whole reason that people don't like gay people because they're disgusted by sexual contact with the same sex, because any like unusual behavior is some signal of disease. And people have talked about this being disgust related, prejudice having some disgust relationship. I'm just really low in disgust sensitivity, so I've never really got it, but I can see how people would be, disgusted by people who have unusual phenotypes of various kinds, and that includes like behavioral phenotypes. Phenotype as in the expression of, all your characteristics, the expression of all your genetics, your behavior and your physical features.
When it comes to disgust, what comes first? Do I develop? So think of vegetarianism, for example. Do I become a vegetarian because I'm disgusted to eat meat, or do I decide to become a vegetarian and then I develop disgust sensitivity towards meat? What is there a cart before the horse? What's the?
I think in terms of vegetarianism, I've done some research on this, but I think it can go both ways. So it's unclear. I think a lot of people become vegetarians because they're disgusted by meat. And you can see good evidence for this because they still eat fish and chicken, which is the less meaty forms of meat. So they're obviously not doing it like on a principled stance because they still eat animals. They just eat like less gross versions of those same things. There's a old blog that I really like, which is called Disgust Kills the Vegan Martyr, which basically says that vegans become very disgust sensitive at meat so that they no longer feel like they're missing out. Mm-hmm. And this is definitely a coping strategy that I've seen a lot of vegans engage in because, like I'm not properly vegan anymore. I eat dairy. If something is going to waste, I will eat that generally, like whether it's red meat or whatever. I'm pretty principled about not eating a few things, but I'm not, I wouldn't necessarily call myself properly vegan anymore. And I was really properly vegan for like 8 or 9 years. But, for me, if I said to somebody, look, I was walking by a table and somebody had like completely left, and this actually happened, had an untouched fish and chips out at a pub in Oxford. I guess they got a phone call or something. They left. They never came back. I waited 5 minutes and then I ate it. Somebody's like, oh, would you eat? If there was like a homeless person, would you eat a dead baby or would you eat a dead human being? I'm like, well, probably not, because like I don't know how best to prepare them. Like I don't know, but I don't. What they were saying is that I should be as disgusted about eating a fish or a piece of chicken or a piece of beef or a piece of pork as I would be about eating like a human fetus or like a man's leg, and. It's actually very funny. There's a cannibalism taboo in all kinds of different species. Even rats won't eat other dead rats, and rats will eat basically anything. And there's a few good reasons for that, but yeah.
I mean, disease transmission. It's probably not very popular when you eat someone else's son, right? For social bonds.
So disease transmission. Yeah, disease transmission is the main one. So for rats, I don't know who did this incredibly perverse study, but I salute them. I think with the rats, they did something where like there were two different dead rats. One of them was like kind of gnawed on and was missing some of its skin, and the other one wasn't. And what I remember reading was that rats were more likely to eat a member of their same species that looked like it had been killed by a predator than looked like it had been killed by disease. So if there were cues that it had been killed by a predator, then it was probably safe to eat. Whereas if it was cues that it had been killed by disease, where like it still had all its fur on and it was kind of just like dead where it sat, then I think they were more wary of that. Yeah, because of disease transmission. But yeah, cannibalism in human societies is very common. And there's a two. There's survival cannibalism, but there's also magical cannibalism, where you want to get somebody's qualities as your own. Yeah.
I mean, it's probably the case that in 99% of situations in which you come across a dead human body, you don't want to eat it. And so your disgust sensitivity just blankets every case that it doesn't even bother with the 1% because it's not worth it, right?
If I hadn't eaten in like a month, I would definitely eat a person. But yeah, you also have to think about like the kind of cost and benefit. There's a researcher called Peter Todd who did a really funny study. So a couple years back, they actually did it online last year, but it was a few years ago they did it in person. I was at a conference called the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting. And so it was like, zombie related talks, but like also you could take whatever you were working on and make it zombie related. So Peter Todd had this funny study he did with people where he asked them, when is the last time you ate? And then he had like a slider where you could slide between a picture of a walnut and a picture of a human brain. And so as you did the slider, it became more and more brain-like. And as you did the slider the other way, it became more and more walnut-like. Similar thing with like a baby carrot and a human finger. So as you move the slider, it gets more and more finger-like. As you move the slider, it gets more and more carrot-like, right? And I think his study basically showed that like the hungrier you are, the closer you'll eat the object to brain or finger than to carrot or walnut. So like he said like at what point on this like trajectory from walnut to brain would be like the bare minimum requirement for you to eat this, from brain to walnut. So people made that conversion faster when they were hungrier.
I love that these studies are being paid for. It's amazing.
I think he did a study just for the conference. He's really good. Yeah, I mean, it was very creative. I liked it.
So in terms of, when we look at the impact of sex on our culture, you often, sex influences songs, movies, all sorts of things in the cultural sphere. But does it also have an impact on innovation and scientific discovery? Is there some sort of impact of status seeking, for example?
Oh yeah, I do think so. And I was making fun on Twitter. This is like a few weeks ago, but that given that one of the major perks of status in all non-human animals is that you get greater sexual access. It's funny to me that people are so surprised when high status people try and get greater sexual access as a perk of their high status. You're like, why would people even strive for status? It's possible. It's entirely possible, right? For like people a specific person to want to strive for status and have no sexual interest at all, be completely monogamous with whoever they are, or like even be asexual. I actually think asexuals are probably some of the most productive people in society because they're not chasing tail. Like they have a lot more time and energy to like focus on something. They might not be as inspired to get certain things done, to actualize certain specific mating strategies. But in terms of, I'm just an evolutionary psychologist. And basically I think that the main reason that people strive for status, that men strive for status or have an inclination and an instinct to strive for status is for greater sexual opportunities. I don't think that women necessarily strive for status for the same reasons. Women do strive for status, but I think that they strive for status for more social reasons.
So what do you think the impact long-term will be of, so for example, the Me Too movement? Is this placing additional costs on males' reproductive strategy, and will that have some sort of long-term influence on the way that men and women approach reproducing?
My view on Me Too is that when we think about the harm that is caused when somebody comes onto someone and it's unwanted, or somebody even touches somebody and it's unwanted, right now we are calibrated to see that harm as the greatest possible harm it could cause. So the harm to the most possible sensitive person. And I don't think that's necessarily good. I also think that there's no like balance that people are considering between the good that somebody causes in society and the harm that they caused like any particular person by unwanted like an unwanted come on of any kind. And you do obviously see the rules applied very, very inconsistently. So right now, in the United States, there's this big controversy over this guy called Cuomo, the governor of New York. I don't even keep up with politics. And he, around the time of coronavirus, there's good evidence that he took elderly people who had coronavirus, he put them in nursing homes, and he almost certainly has the deaths of I don't know how many elderly people on his hands because of the way that he mishandled these elderly patients with COVID. Okay, people didn't like that. He tried to cover it up. They thought that was bad. But what's actually sinking him is that like 12 women have come forward and said that he like groped them, or that he came onto them, or that he touched them in an unwanted way. I think that Me Too I just don't think it makes a lot of sense to say that somebody has caused greater harm touching 12 women in an unwanted way than by killing old people. In my view, you could grab 100 women's asses and it wouldn't be as bad as killing one old person. But, that's just like my calculus morally, like about how these kinds of things work. So I do think that Me Too has gone really far in that a lot of people were kicked out of various offices or couldn't get movie deals or whatever because of a single allegation. I think in many of these cases, either the story was exaggerated or the person wasn't actually very specifically harmed by it. But this is the kind of reckoning that we're going to have to see in society. And I did a really long interview with Robert Wright, who wrote The Moral Animal, on this. He was very much of the opinion that Me Too is good. And I was of the opinion that Me Too is mixed. It's not being consistently applied. It's not morally coherent or consistent. And that the real purpose of Me Too is to get women in more positions of power. So like any allegation against any man was at that time, in the heyday of Me Too, taken seriously. Men were ousted, and women almost always took these men's positions. And I think that if you see the outcome as the motivation, then that's what I think was the motivation, was to improve the representation of women in positions of power. I don't think it was necessarily about protecting women, because in many of these contexts, it was unclear, if any harm was actually caused.
Mm-hmm. I suppose if that is the case, if men strive for positions of power so that they can get access to women, and they're now barred from doing that, then maybe in the long term that may have the desired effect, if that is what people wanted in the first place. My very unpopular view is that a lot of people who strive for status, who achieve positions of power because of unconscious or conscious sexual motivations, they were doing, they were good at their jobs. And if we oust everybody who has a sexual motivation or who tries to come on to people on the basis of their high status, then we will lose people who are highly driven and highly competent. And I think that the cost of that is greater than the cost of
some people being, it really also depends on, on the harm. I remember there's a public radio personality in the United States called Garrison Keillor, and he was like the voice of my childhood. Like I heard him all the time, and he was ousted on the basis of one complaint from an anonymous woman who he claims he had a totally consensual affair with, but it was because he was working for like the public radio, and they were not going to ignore anything that he did or said. So I think in that particular case, like he brought pleasure and joy to like millions of people. I just don't think that there's any consideration of the cost benefit, as I think there should be in every context.
Well, I suppose, on the other hand, if someone has legitimately caused harm to people who are underneath them, I mean, that's, in whatever context, that's not good, right? I mean...
Yeah, and that's a bad work environment, and it could cause, it does mean that the person who is high status is not going to be able to accomplish their goals. They're not going to be able to help people out. They're not going to be able to actualize their agenda that people necessarily want if people under them feel unsafe. But I think that there was actually, around the time Me Too had its heyday, there was This American Life about a specific man, and This American Life was called Five Women. And it was about this guy who was a big deal at some company. Now I can't remember the name of it. And he had a wife, and he had 4 women working under him, and he sexually harassed them all to some degree. So it shows their very, very varied responses to that. So one woman was like, look, I applied for this job. I knew that I actually didn't have the qualifications. I just applied for it on a whim. I could tell this guy fancied me. And so I ended up getting the job, even though I didn't really have qualifications. I was grateful for that. So like he showed me a couple pictures of his penis, not a big deal. He showed them to him on his he was like sitting next to her, and he showed them to her on his phone. Like she wasn't traumatized for that. And like on balance, she's like, okay, I'd rather have this job and see a couple pictures of this guy's penis than not have this job. And I think I'm glad that they did that, because these contexts are nuanced, and there are women who know exactly what they're doing and what they're getting into. Women are not babes in the woods that a lot of women are using these sexual contexts to their advantage.
I guess society needs to calibrate, right? There's a lot of new technology that's coming in, for example, that's, we weren't able to show people pictures of penises on phones 20 years ago. And I suppose as our society shifts and sort of accommodates new technologies, new developments, we're going to be sort of swinging back and forth on the appropriate way to deal with office relationships, let's say, or power plays from whichever sex. But what about other impacts? So in terms of talking about technology on sexual dynamics, what's the impact that, for example, what was the impact of the pill when that came on? So what impact did that have on sexual power dynamics between men and women?
I think that men and women still have a lot of the same instincts. So, for example, a woman could be on contraception and have sex with someone outside of her relationship, and a man will be just as jealous and just as aggressive and angry as if she was not on any contraceptives, because there's a very deep history of cuckoldry. Men don't want to be cuckolded. They don't want to be taking care of offspring that aren't their own. And so, in a lot of ways, it hasn't changed things. Similarly, if a woman is having sex with a man on a regular basis, she is looking for cues that he's committed, invested in her, in case they have children together. Because, it'd be really important that she didn't get pregnant without any care or security. If she's on the pill, it shouldn't actually matter. Or if she's postmenopausal, it shouldn't really matter. But there's actually not that much we can do about these enduring psychological responses to romantic relationships. I mean, you can make conscious and more rational decisions. It's much easier to choose to be child-free at this point in history than at any previous point in history. It used to be that whether you wanted children or not, if you ever liked to have sex, even a little bit, you were going to have children. inevitably, right? It didn't really matter much what you thought specifically about the outcome. But I don't really know how much the power dynamics have actually changed. It seems like, women have more ability to plan their reproductive life, and therefore they can gain greater independence and greater financial freedom, which gives them a certain amount of security without men. College-educated women, I think, initiate like 90% of divorces, and I think that wouldn't be possible without contraception.
I guess when men were earning the money and women were at home, they didn't really have the option to divorce, right? I mean, they would have ended up with nothing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a social safety net and there's welfare and stuff like that. But no, they would have had a very big change in lifestyle if they had left their husbands. I haven't read this paper yet, but there's a paper out by a few of my evolutionary psych colleagues, Marty Hazelton, Christina Durante, Sarah Hill, about the evolutionary psychology of women initiating divorces, and I cannot wait to read it. So I just had to look at it today.
What about moving forward a little bit? So porn and eventually sex robots, I suppose, which are going to be coming online anytime soon. I guess that we already have sex robots. What impact are these going to have on sexual dynamics?
I wrote a whole thing about sex robots, and I haven't really paid much attention to sex robots since then. I think it's going to be a while before they're very highly perfected. But in the piece that I wrote, which is called Uncanny Vulvas, you can see it on my... have you read it?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I basically make the case that it's going to change men and women's psychology in a way that's quite similar to what you would see as sex ratios. So the fewer women there are, on college campuses, for example, when there's a minority of women, you see that women have greater power because there's fewer women to choose from. Men cannot switch as quite as easily. And so, for example, in a minority female campus, you see that fewer couples are having sex. It's like women are calling the shots, basically, because the switching costs for men are either high or they have got nobody to switch to. In terms of sex robots, I basically just said it was going to be a major driver of innovation and that we should expect them. I also said that unmated men, that is men who have no partners and have no ability to get partners, are very dangerous, and that it was going to help societies that men had some outlet, some environmental cue that said they are doing well and that they don't need to do anything risky, dangerous, or aggressive in order to get mates.
In other words, they're getting sex, and so their body tells them not to. The body doesn't realize it's with a robot.
Well, if the robot's convincing enough, yeah. So it's a cue. I mean, you can imagine, like, if you can become aroused looking at, back in the 1950s, men were masturbating to literal black and white postcards of naked women. Oftentimes these women were like, not the kinds of looking women that they knew in real life, because these women were like women who got paid to get naked. So they weren't necessarily like the most beautiful, most high class women, therefore, right? They were like just whoever was willing to get naked and have pictures taken of themselves. So if you can get an erection and have an orgasm to a picture like that, and now there's like full color porn, et cetera, robots are going to be really emulating that to a really great extent. And there's some evidence that access to pornography decreases the rate of sexual assault in societies. I think that the evidence is pretty good for that. And I think that would have quite a similar effect, yeah.
So what's the difference between, I mean, we've had vibrators forever, right? So what's the difference between, sex robots and vibrators? Why will they have a bigger impact?
Well, so vibrators are made mostly for women. And when women have sex with people, they're not primarily looking for a sexual experience or a sexual outlet. They are looking for a variety of other contextual factors. I mean, that's one reason why women take so much longer to assess a mate and why they take a lot longer to figure out, if they want to have sex with somebody or not, compared to men. So for women, vibrators don't fundamentally change the sexual dynamic because they are not replacing the majority of things that women are looking for. So this has to do with like the huge asymmetry. So for men, any sexual opportunity is a good opportunity, and men's, you see this in non-human animals as well. So like in males of all different non-human animals, their rate of responding to any facsimile of anything that looks remotely female is much higher than females of that same species. So male sea otters will mate with baby seals. A turkey or a pheasant will actually do a mating dance for a red ball suspended from the ceiling or a disembodied head of a female. They'll do a mating dance for that. For a bull, if you want to get a semen out of a bull, I think you just need a big condom and like a wooden stand with 4 legs on it. And for men, you've seen like normal, whatever, sex dolls, the blow up dolls they sell in shops or whatever, which like look nothing really like human.
It's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? That males of all species are.
and human men are much more likely to have sex with animals than human women are. Much more likely. And Kinsey found this out. I mean, Kinsey's got some faults with his data. So for men, a missed sexual opportunity is a much greater missed opportunity than for a woman, because as I said, if you're buying babies for $1, you want to have as many babies as you can, whereas for women they're much more costly. And so vibrators don't fundamentally change. You could say that like the welfare state fundamentally changes the dynamics between men and women, because it means the government is providing something for women that previously was only provided for by men. So many sex robots are like the welfare state. That's a point I've never made before, so that's good.
Wait, so the sex robots for men are like the welfare state for women?
Well, I'm just saying that like the welfare state replaces something that previously was only available through a partnership with a man, which is security, housing. I mean, things that were only available through partnership with a man for the last few hundred years. Because like obviously, if you live in some groups in out in the world, you don't need a man at all. You can like you and your mom can build a hut together and forage for food, and like you don't need men around you depending on where you live. But yeah, for the past few hundred years, the only way to get security and safety and food was for a woman was through partnership with a man. Yeah.
I wonder. So it sounds like. When the robots finally take over, it might not be through violence. It might just be that they sexually outcompete all the women. We have an army of perfect robot women.
I think that, I basically thought that a lot of the outcomes would be, pretty good. And you do see, like, I wonder sometimes video games are incredibly compelling. And I wonder if there were men who would be just amazingly competent at problem solving in day-to-day life, but they're so compelled by the bite-sized and perfectly flowy, like, video games get you in a perfect flow state. Those kinds of problems that are available, as opposed to going out in the world and tackling like more difficult problems. And you can imagine something similar happening with like sex robots. If I say, like I said earlier, that a lot of men are trying to achieve status for sexual reasons, you might also expect that sex robots would also degrade men's pursuit of status for sexual reasons.
So what about so I guess, at the moment, all reproduction involves 2 people, but in the future, maybe we'll have artificial wombs, maybe 2 women will be able to have children together. What sort of impact do you think those sorts of technologies will have on sexual relations and relations in general?
I think that even though there's a lot of possibilities already, I think that you can make babies with 3 people. I think that's a new thing that you can do. I mean, it's not like 30%, 30% or whatever, 33%. What they did was they had 2 people and then one person had a genetic problem. So they just like took a bit of genotype from somebody else and like stuck it in. I don't remember how they did that exactly. It wasn't CRISPR, I don't think. I just think that as much as you might think that these things are going to fundamentally change sexual dynamics, we have certain evolved sexual dynamics. And so people can choose to do something different. You could choose if you are attracted to women or you are in a partnership with a woman. I do think it's going to be wonderful when two women or two men can have babies that are genetically theirs, because right now, I don't know what these conversations are like because I'm not in a same-sex relationship. And I only know a few people who are in same-sex relationships who have children. But it's a difficult conversation to have, to say, okay, who's going to be related to the kid and who's not. And sometimes you get around that by, so I think I know a lesbian couple where one woman had a baby with the sperm of the brother of her partner. Mm-hmm. So at least one of them would be raising her niece or nephew and not completely unrelated. So I think that's great because I do think that people take better care of children that are genetically related to them on average. Obviously there are people who adopt and they take wonderful care of children, and adopted children are certainly getting better care than they would in a kind of foster care system with somebody who's committed to taking care of them for life and to adopting them completely. But there's a reason why people choose to use donor gametes, like donor eggs and donor sperm, above and beyond adopting, not just because adopting is very difficult and the standards for choosing adoptive parents are really high, much higher than the standards for using reproductive technology.
I wonder, is it the case, so men will more or less can never know 100% that the child is theirs, whereas women always know. Is it the case that men are generally sort of more the same with adoptive children, whereas women see a decrease in, caring or when it comes to adoptive children?
I have wondered this myself, and I don't know of any data on this in particular. For men, so I'm going to kind of pivot and then I'll get back to this. So Deb Lieberman, who is a disgust researcher, did a few really great studies, and she was interested in incest avoidance and incest aversion. So how do you know that somebody is your sibling and that you should avoid having sex with them? Well, there's some cues that are associated with that. How long did you live together as children? That's one cue. And did you see this person nursing at your mother's breast? That's another cue. So if somebody's younger than you, if you see that person nursing at the mother's breast, it's an indicator they're related to you for sure. If you live together a long time as children, that's another indicator. And so I think when people use a donor egg, they like using a donor egg because they get all the cues that that child's genetically related to them. Even if they consciously know that child is not, all the cues are there, like all the hormonal and physiological cues are there. And also a man will get cues that the baby belongs to him and probably be more invested if he sees that baby coming out of the woman he has sex with from the day it is born, right? So I think that that's one reason why older children are less desirable, is not just because you're getting fewer cues that they're related to you, so it's harder to hack, but also because those children often have other problems, which is why nobody's adopted them. So there's both selection effects and also kind of an evolved psychological aspect to it.
So do you think, with new technology coming online, do you think over time, the difference, obviously this won't happen in 1 or 2 generations, but when people can use artificial wombs, when we can use technology to have, children between 2 women or between 2 men, when the selection pressure that's on men and women sexually is sort of homogenized, are we going to get into a situation where men and women become more and more similar over time?
I don't really think, I mean, it's unclear how things are going to go in terms of like a transhumanist trajectory. I do think artificial wombs would be great. They would free women up a lot. Right now it's partly because of the kind of nurture assumption we have in society. Pregnant women are held accountable for so much. There's these ideas that you take a Valium or you drink a cup of coffee and you're going to screw your fetus up forever. I think there's a tremendous pressure on pregnant women, which could be alleviated necessarily with artificial wombs. But, we were just talking about how you could become less attached to a child that you don't give birth to yourself. And there were some studies done like in the 1960s where I think it was a actual randomized trial where they either separated women from their newborns for 3 hours or they gave them to them right away. And allegedly, this is what the data says, that women treated their babies different just from that 3 or 4 hour separation for the rest of their lives, that they were less attached to children who they had been separated from in that kind of sensitive period. And so I think that if we were to use something like artificial wombs, that we would also have to figure out some way of manifesting the same attachment cascade, physiological cascade. I don't know, maybe give somebody a megadose of oxytocin and MDMA. I don't know exactly what you would do, but you would have to be able to do some facsimile of that kind of sensitive period. You're right that I don't actually know how men become attached to infants. It must have something to do with seeing. I don't think it means seeing a woman give birth, because men, I think by and large across societies, don't see women give birth because it's something that, it's a place that men don't really belong. You had something to do with this, but this is not your place right this moment. But I think, yes, seeing the woman you're having sex with nurse a baby is probably the major cue there. It's interesting also that women who are pregnant are often major victims of domestic violence, and I think that also has to do with kind of cuckoldry fear. So if you were on the rocks and you were taking a break, or you were having sex with other people for a period of time around the time the woman conceived, I could see how that would precipitate a aggressive relationship between the man and the woman, because he's got some doubts that she's carrying his child. This is not in any way to legitimize domestic violence. I'm just saying that these are contexts that could precipitate greater abuse.
This study where they separated babies from mothers for 3 hours and then found that throughout their entire life, they had some different behavior towards that. How do they test that? It seems like such a...
I think it was just like a questionnaire. This is 60s or 70s. It wasn't very...
You could never do this again.
It wasn't very sophisticated. I don't think you could do it again. You could almost certainly have a natural experiment. I don't know if people... I think there are people who do research on how women who have C-sections feel differently. But again, if you have a C-section or you're induced, you have a lot of the same kinds of things that are happening. Or based on whether or not you breastfeed. I don't know if the bonding would be different. But I also think women differ a lot in their, I know a woman who said, I want to have a completely natural birth. I want to be unmedicated entirely because I've always been ambivalent about having children. And I want to make sure really all the cues possible are in place, that are natural, even though, the excruciating pain of labor. I want to make sure that's all in place so that I bond with my baby adequately, because I'm not a very naturally maternal person. Whereas I think that there's such big individual differences. I think that there are probably some women where you could be like, here's a 3-month-old baby, and they could treat that baby better and take better care of it and be more attached to it than a woman who gives birth, herself. So it really depends on I think you'd have to do a study with identical twins, because I think maternal instinct, there's always going to be some inherent variability.
What is this, knowing the differences between men and women in terms of their psychology, temperament, behavior, what can that be used for? So for example, I'm a physicist or mathematician, and often people talk about representation in STEM fields of women, for example. Do you think there's anything that you could use this knowledge for in terms of, if you wanted to change the levels of representation, for example? Do you think, for instance, that positive discrimination in terms of giving, jobs to certain groups that are represented is a good way to go? Or is there some different way that you would approach these sorts of questions?
There's a really good study. It's had, I think, 4 cohorts. It's called the study of mathematically precocious youth. And what they did is they took hundreds of students who scored, I want to say, in the top 10th of 1 percentile on the math and analytical segment of the SAT from, I want to say, the 60s to the 90s. And then they followed these people for generations or, decades, and saw what happened with them. And they tried to figure out what these men and women would end up doing. And they saw that these women who, had this like 1 in 1,000 score on the math portion of the SAT were more likely to go into STEM. But the men in that same cohort, men who scored, in the top 10% of 1%, on math, also doubled their representation in STEM relative to men who scored more averagely on those on that. So they were like, okay, why are these women not necessarily going into STEM? Well, women who are very mathematically gifted tend to also be gifted in other domains. They also tend to also be like verbally gifted and socially gifted. There's an idea that like men who are mathematically gifted, there's more of like a trade-off. So there are like a lot more men. There's like, I think like 4 times as many men who are exceptionally mathematically gifted compared to women, but those men are more likely to have social or verbal deficits, or what's called math. Have you ever heard of math tilt versus verbal tilt?
Yeah.
So like I'm super verbal tilt, and I'm better at math than the average woman, but like I'm not, or I'm just barely better than math than the average man. So these women seem to have to make less difficult choices. For the men who were in the study of mathematically precocious youth, their main gift was math. Mm-hmm. For the women in the study of mathematically precocious youth. Anyway, so they followed these women for decades, and they also asked them, what are the most important things in terms of your life? And for women compared to men, so it's interesting because what they've done in this particular study is they've controlled the cognitive gifts of these people, mm-hmm. right? If you just like look at the average man and the average woman, but these are people who are very mathematically gifted, who could work in STEM, who could make a lot of money in a variety of different industries. And what they found in these studies is that these women said that working close to their children, taking care of their families, having hobbies, having close friends, taking good care of their health and the health of their family was way more important than the men in these particular studies did. And the men in these particular studies said that they were much more interested in making money and gaining status in their field than the women were. These are men and women who have similar, cognitive gifts. The other thing is that they asked these men and women, if you could work at your ideal job, how many hours of work would you work at your ideal job? 30% of men in this study said that they would work 40 hours a week or more at their ideal job. 7% of women in this study said that they would work 40 hours a week or more at their ideal job. So this particular study, which is in Charles Murray's Human Diversity, which a bunch of people have talked about when they talk about these sex differences, as evidence that even if you look at very mathematically gifted women, they're just not as interested in work on average. I'm not saying that like any individual woman necessarily against any individual man, but on average, you're going to see these kinds of differences. And you can have as many, female role models in these industries as you want. You can show young girls a lot of engineers and things. It's just going to be people like to do what they're good at. And even if a woman is exceptionally mathematically gifted, she might enjoy more doing something that's got more of a social or verbal component to it. And, everybody knows about the Google memo, James Damore Google memo. James Damore has a bunch of different things that he suggests at the end of his memo as ways to encourage women to be more likely to be programmers. For example, he says that, we can make it more social. He says that women are more, what does he say, more generous or more kind or more altruistic than men are? That's not true. That's one of the things in that memo that's actually not true. He actually makes he says nice things about women that aren't necessarily true. But, he tries to say, what are these different ways that we can entice women into this field? These are things that you could definitely try, but I think that equal representation isn't important. And I don't know why we would try to, why don't we just have people doing the things that they're most interested in? My friend who is a Russian Jew, his father went to a Siberian university in Russia because that was the only university that Jews were allowed to study physics, was in Siberia. And like, yeah, that's terrible discrimination. But his dad really, really wanted to study physics because he moved to Siberia for it, right? And so I think that when you get involved in equal representation, one trade-off that nobody ever really wants to talk about is when you really push equal representation, you're necessarily going to get people who are like more ambivalent about being involved in your field at all, who don't stay there, or who decide to do something else.
So what do you think we should be aiming for? Like if you were in charge of university admissions, would you just completely scrub diversity quotas, Well, what would your approach be?
I mean, at the University of Portsmouth, where I worked for like 8 years, we had numbers on student records, and when students did examinations, I didn't know who they were. I didn't know their names. I didn't know their sex, and I didn't know their race. And we were grading students on that basis. And in the UK, we call students who are minorities BAME. That's Black, Asian, Minority. Can't remember what the end of that means. And those students were still doing worse, even with totally anonymized exams. I can't remember if we had different entrance criteria for minority students or not. But they were trying to figure out a way to fix this lower grades of BAME students while also keeping this anonymous, this anonymized exams. And I think that like anonymized exams is like the best you can possibly do. And anonymized applications is the best that you can possibly do. I have a friend who is really into diversity and equity and inclusion. She wrote, something really good about it. She wanted me to look it over because she knows that I'm contrary to her, ideologically on this. And in her piece, she wrote that there's a variety of different ways that you can tell whether or not someone is male or female, majority ethnicity versus minority ethnicity, based on the way they write or how they format things or whatever. And that these like subtle clues, really make things like not exactly anonymous. And so that you have to compensate for these things. Like not exactly affirmative action, but anyway, I just disagree with all this. I think that you should anonymize everything. And then, I just think that if I really want to do something with my life, but like the fact that I haven't seen another woman do it is like a major obstacle for me. I think that I'm probably not as interested in that thing. I'm not as quite as internally motivated as somebody who would be willing to do it regardless of what they saw. There's a whole conversation about role models and a bunch of bad research about it. There was some terrible study. There was just a terrible study where like, girls who watched the X-Files who saw, what was Gillian Anderson's character, Mulder? Was she Mulder or was she Scully?
I never, wait.
Anyway.
Yeah. I never watched this. I think she's Mulder. I'm not sure. So
girls who watched X-Files were much more likely to be interested in STEM. They're like, this is great, because what they're showing is that this is like, it's because they saw this female role model. No, girls who watched the X-Files were nerds, and of course they were more interested in STEM overall than like girls who didn't watch the X-Files. It wasn't because they saw a female role model. It was because they were watching X-Files because they were nerds to begin with. It was because of their original individual difference, not because of how X-Files culturally changed them. So that's my view, but people are going to keep striving for equal representation. And, you're going to get women and you're going to get people who, of various kinds to necessarily, decide that they're going to major in a certain field, or they're going to go to a certain university, and then they're going to be less committed because they were given these kinds of external incentives. Compared to people who I think are more intrinsically or innately kind of interested in these things.
I find it quite interesting where attention is placed, though. I mean, universities in general have more women going to them in the student cohort, and then there's lots of other subjects that are female dominant where you don't hear about this as being a problem. It's very interesting in my mind that STEM is singled out. But something you said made me interested. There's a piece of software, I don't know what it's called, that's used to, you can determine what percentage of a paper someone has authored. It's some artificial intelligence. It looks at all the things they've written and it says they were responsible for 20% of that. I suppose you could train that sort of software to scrape through all the applications, work out which anonymized ones are from, students of whatever category you're interested in. I mean, the technology's there if you really want to go through and anonymize things and still, skew.
Still discriminate. It seems difficult to do. One funny thing is that psychology is dominated by female grad students, although the representation of faculty tends to be more 50-50. And then evolutionary psychology tends to be 50-50. So they call that like a leaky pipeline. They say that women are likely to get out. But if you look at the study of mathematically precocious youth, you'll see that like for women, working at a job that has these incredibly distal rewards, like the reward of being a full professor, is just not as like enticing to them. That's not something that they're as motivated towards. And so that's not necessarily a leaky pipeline, so much as it is like the same incentive structure that's necessarily going to be likely to get you the best people is also one in which women may not be as necessarily interested in competing. I can't remember the other point I was going to make.
Well, I suppose academia in general has this problem where, universities produce the product that they then use. So there's like this weird supply-demand thing that's going on. So they produce the PhDs and then they also employ the PhDs. And so they like to produce a lot of PhDs because it creates competition that's in their favor. So it's not.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who drop out of programs too. But the joke was that somebody said, "Oh, why don't we do affirmative action for male graduate students because they're the minority," which is funny. Nobody was interested in doing that.
No, I don't think that. Yeah, but I suppose also with STEM, if you include medicine and all these things, then it evens out somewhat. It's only if you look at...
Yeah, absolutely. If you include medicine. I mean, there's even interesting differences in like specialties of medicine between men and women. Women are more likely to end up in, pediatrics. Men are more likely to end up in surgery.
Yeah. I don't think... we should probably wrap this up at some point. So let me ask you just one or two quick other questions. Can you, so in terms of personality, so could you give a questionnaire to a bunch of people and then determine, that such and such a person is female to 70% accuracy or, so that's doable, is it?
Yeah. There's even a study that one of my colleagues did where he just asked people, various questions about their mate preferences. Like, do you want somebody older or younger, whatever? Yeah, but you can tell with this paper. Actually, if you go to my website, if you look up Science of Sex Differences syllabus, it's on Diannaverse. You can see a bunch of different studies and articles that I have put up there, where you can see, I think the sex difference in terms of personality. I think you can tell with personality questionnaires if somebody is male or female with 96% accuracy.
But is that including questions like, is your sexual preference for women or for men? I mean...
No, that's excluding that. That is excluding that. And I also think that like if you excluded gay men and gay women, you'd get a greater accuracy because these people, gay men and gay women, and bisexual women too, tend to be less gender typical.
And I suppose transgender and intersex and so on.
I've got this is like I think going to be a problem the more gender fluid people become. I think actually this might be the like actual desired outcome of this kind of gender fluidity thing is people really muddying up any research on sex differences. Because if somebody's like, I'm a woman and I was, as a very aggressive child, you're like, oh, okay. Little boys are not necessarily more aggressive than little girls. Like people are not necessarily reporting their sex assigned at birth. And I don't necessarily, some trans people are more similar to the opposite sex, and some are not. Depends on, it's actually going to depend on, as I said, the taxonomy is fraught.
But do you think there's actually a directed goal behind, the increase in... people are interested at the moment, like right now today, the issue that's on the cards is transgender rights, right? That's what people are interested in currently. Do you believe there's some bigger push? Is it really a directed goal?
Yeah,
you make
I don't think that's a conspiracy or a directed goal, but I think that two things. I think that some people choose an identity based on their ideology. So I think that there are many people who think that sex differences research is fascistic or oppressive or biologically determinist, and they choose to identify as gender nonconforming or non-binary in the service of that goal. Similarly, there are people who are Marxists or communists of various kinds who identify as polyamorous because they think that owning or being possessive about any particular person in a romantic relationship is wrong from a Marxist perspective, right? It's like capitalism in romance, right? And so for that reason, they choose to have a different personal identity. So I think that there is ideologically driven ways that people change their identities, to try and disprove a cultural narrative that they disagree with ideologically.
I guess the reason why I ask is because previously when we spoke about Me Too, for example, you could imagine that there's some directed pressure that's aiming to reduce the incentives for men to seek powerful positions as an effort to level the number of women and men who are CEOs or in government or whatever. But it's likely not the case that, it's likely that it's just individuals that are particularly interested in this particular issue, right? That there's probably no directed thought down the line. I
don't think necessarily, that there's a concerted effort. I think that my hunch, right, is if you were collect information about Me Too, who's likely to get ousted in terms of Me Too, it would have something to do with the politics of the person who's going to get ousted. So I think that Joe Biden got in a lot less trouble for whatever allegations were against him than Trump got in trouble for whatever the grab her by the pussy quote, even though that actually wasn't a woman in particular complaining. It was just him speaking crassly off the cuff. I think that if you were to look at individual cases of men who got ousted, it probably would be predictive if there was a woman interested in taking that particular person's position. Mm-hmm. I think that would be as predictive as, or even more predictive potentially, than the harm that they cause an individual woman or a group of women.
I don't have a clean way of wrapping up this conversation. This conversation's been interesting and bouncing all over the place.
Everything from cannibalism to Me Too to all kinds of craziness.
Usually I have a bow, but it seems like I'm not going to be able to pull out a bow on this one. But in any case, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been really good.
Escaped Sapiens.